of fun. And we have a special speaker here today before I introduce her. My name's Michelle. I work in children's, and I'm glad you all could be here today. We're going to float things. We're going to try to sink some things. We are going to make ice melt. We're going to find objects. Hi, who do we have? So, with that in mind, the way we're going to work this is we're going to have our special speaker talk to us for a little while. And then we're going to break up into groups at the different stations, groups of 4. We may have to go up to groups of 5. And then I'll tell you when it's time to rotate, and you'll just move to the table next to you. That way everybody will get a chance at all the stations. Okay? Did you register? Yes. Okay, underneath. Okay, come on. All right. With no further ado, there were some very special people on the Titanic, one of which happened to be a Missourian. And one of those people just happened to be here today to tell us their story. Now, obviously, she's not the real person that was on the Titanic, which some kids thought was the case last time. But she is pretending to be that person and telling that story. So I want you all to welcome Miss Molly Brown.
I'm so glad to see all of you. Ever since this event happened to me, I have had the chance to travel all over the country and talk with groups like you about what happened to me on the Titanic. I was born in Hannibal. I was not born wealthy. I managed to luck into my elite status, as it were, as my husband had a mine and he struck it rich. So I had a lot of money to play with, and I enjoyed it very much. One of my favorite things to do was to travel. As it happened in January of 1912, I decided to do a tour of Europe. And I went with my daughter and we traveled over on the Olympic. The Olympic was the sister ship of the Titanic. They were almost identical to one another. So taking a voyage on the Titanic was not really that special at the time. If you wanted to go to Europe, you had to take a steamship. And the companies were trying to outdo each other to see who could have the most beautiful, the most luxurious, the fastest ship. Now, White Star Line, they didn't want to have the fastest ship. They wanted to have the most beautiful ship. And in my opinion, they succeeded. Anything you can imagine that you would want to do was on board. There was a gymnasium with the state-of-the-art equipment. There was a swimming bath where you could go and swim, although you had to pay extra for that. And as I'm not a big fan of those little outfits you wear when you swim, I did not partake of this. But I could have if I wanted to. There were opulent restaurants. Some of them cost extra to go there. And their staffs were not even a part of the White Star Line staff. So I was having a wonderful time in Europe, but I received word that someone in my family was ill. And so I booked passage on the Titanic only because it was the first ship leaving that could get me back to New York to be with my family member. The first 4 days were absolutely wonderful. I had a room on E-deck, which was near the dining room, near the reception area. And that particular evening, it was a Sunday. It had been a glorious day. We had church. All of the classes had church that day. And I had retired for the evening. It was after 11:30, I would say around 11:40 probably, and I was reading a book in my bed. I cannot tell you what that book was. Because of everything that happened afterwards, I just don't remember. Whatever book it was is at the bottom of the ocean now. I was reading and I did feel something. Something not normal. I have been known in my life to tell the story that I was thrown from my bed onto the ground. Not quite. It was very gentle, but it was obvious that we had hit something. And so I got up and I opened my door and I looked out into the hallway. I did not see anything amiss, and so I went back to reading. A little while later, I start to hear all this noise in the hall. And so I get up and I look into the hallway again, and there are a group of gentlemen standing around and they're talking. And I heard one of them say he had been in the smoking room and he had seen what had happened. And he had come back down to get his friends. And they were all in their pajamas. But again, I thought, oh, nothing, it can't be anything serious. This is the most amazing ship on Earth. It was built with watertight doorways, watertight doors that would stop the water. It had a double hull on the bottom, so if anything hit on the bottom, you were protected there too. It could even have several flooded compartments, and the ship would not sink. So I went back to bed again. Shortly thereafter, one of the gentlemen I had seen in the hall, he had the room across the hall from me, knocked on my door, and he said, "We've been up to the boat deck, and they have told us that we need to get our life preservers and we need to go up onto the deck." I believe this man saved my life because I, up until that point, did not think that there was anything wrong. I had even seen crew members at one point laughing and joking, dealing with something in the floor. I know now that they were trying to manually lower the watertight doors onto F deck, which they would have done from my floor. So these gentlemen tell me this. I get my furs off of my wardrobe. I take all of them. I was traveling by myself, but I thought other people might need my extra life vest. So I went up onto the boat deck, and it was noisy. The ship at this point had stopped. They were releasing the funnels, so there was this noise and all of this steam escaping from the funnels. The crewmen were working with the davits. That's what the ropes were attached to, and they were trying to get the boats swung out and ready for people to get into the boats. And I did what I thought was right, which was I tried to help put people into the boats, and I can tell you a lot of people did not want to go. The ship felt so steady. It felt so safe. We just did not believe it when they told us that we needed to get into these tiny little boats and float out in the middle of the ocean, because we fully expected that they would just make us get right back on in time for breakfast. So why do I want to float out in this little boat and freeze when I have this wonderful ship that's a lifeboat in itself? I don't need to do this. And so it was taking some convincing, and a lot of the first boats that went far below their capacity to carry people. I myself was physically picked up and told, "You're going with this boat." And I can tell you it was pretty scary. Imagine a ship that is 7 stories high, 8 stories, and you have a 2 to 3 foot gap between you and the boat, and all you can see is straight down into the cold water. And ladies were dressed like I am dressed. So can you imagine trying to go across that gap? And it was almost comical the way you would have someone dressed in their evening clothes next to somebody in their night dress, all gathered on the boat deck, waiting for someone to tell us what to do. Well, I'm now in this boat. It's lifeboat number 6 is the one that I was in. There was one gentleman in the boat at first. And as they began to lower us, they lowered us quite a bit. And as you're going down in that boat, those davits jump a little bit. So it's not a smooth ride down to the water. And if the 2 men on each side aren't in sync as they lower you, your boat the front end could go lower than the back end. So it was scary. Well, the one gentleman in our boat begins to complain that there aren't enough men to man the boat. So they ask if there are any other men who are good seamen. And there was a first-class passenger. His name was Arthur Pugin. And he said, I am a yachtsman. And they began discussing how they were going to get him into our boat. Are they going to lower us a little and let him get in? Finally, one of the sailors said, if you're such a good sailor, then you should be able to climb out on this davit and get down into the boat. And by golly, that man did that. He climbed out onto that davit, and he slid like a little monkey down those ropes and got into our boat. And then we were in the ocean, and I decided that we have to row. There still weren't enough men to do that in our boat. There were 28 women. Most of us were first-class passengers, not accustomed to doing labor of any sort. And so I said, ladies, we need to row this boat. And so I put the oar in, and I asked one of the other ladies to put the oar in, and that we were going to row that boat, and we were going to get away from the Titanic as it sank. A lot of us, those of us in the boats, were very afraid of suction, that as a ship sinks, it can suck you down with it, even if you are in a boat. And so we wanted to get away from the wreck. As we were rowing, I could see the ship. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. All the lights were ablaze. You could see all of the people lining the decks. There were still so many people on board. But we rowed, and I said, ladies, we have to save ourselves. We have to stay safe. And so we rowed, and we could hear the music of the band. And they played right up to the end, until it just seemed that water had filled their instruments and they could play no more. And I heard this. And we rowed, and almost until the last minute, the lights stayed on. And then the lights went out. And I heard this terrific noise. There was a sound. The stern raised higher and higher and higher, and you could just hear as everything that wasn't tied down or nailed down went falling. Grand pianos, furniture. I would assume people as well. And then there was a tremendous explosion. I can only assume that that was the cold water hitting the very hot boilers. All you could see at this point was the silhouette of the ship, and slowly it was just gone. For a time we thought that maybe it was going to right itself. The stern fell back down into the water, and we all said, look, it's going to float. But it didn't. Eventually the stern fell away too and was gone. And we continued to row, trying to drown out the sound of those who hadn't gotten into boats. It was a terrible, dreadful sound that I think haunts all of us who were there just to hear it. Now, it's at this point that some of you may have heard of my disagreements with Quartermaster Hitchens. Now, Quartermaster Hitchens was the crew member in our boat, and he wanted to do nothing. He wanted to sit and just float. He told us, no one's going to rescue us. We're going to be out here, and they're never going to find us, and it's all over. And we ladies wanted to row. We were freezing, and rowing would keep us warm. And he continued to argue with me and say, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do anything. And I said, sir, please stop arguing with me or I will throw you overboard. Well, luckily for him, he stopped arguing with me. And we ladies, we rowed and we saved ourselves, and we rowed until morning. It was a very long night. Dawn was breaking the next day when we finally saw a light in the distance. It was the Carpathia coming to get us. They had steamed all night as fast as their ship would go, trying to get there in time to rescue those of us who had survived. They took away all the comforts from their passengers so that all of the energy of that ship would make it go as fast as it could. And they were rushing past icebergs and risking their own lives to get there to save us. It was a scary business. It took us 3 or 4 tries to line up correctly with the ship, and by this time, the seas were much rougher than they had been earlier in the night. But once we were on board, they had coffee and brandy and warm things for us to drink and blankets. And it was very sad because all of the women would line up and they were watching for their loved ones to get off the various boats, watching for their husbands. And of course, they never came. And I was very saddened by this. And I knew that the first thing these people needed to do was they needed to contact their family to let them know they were okay. And so I began a list of names. And we posted it by the staircase, names and addresses who needed to be contacted. And I began collecting money because these people did not have the money to send the telegrams to tell their families that they were alive. And also to try to reunite. Some people were reunited on board the ship. I saw again the gentleman who had knocked on my door and saved my life. His name was Mr. Fitzhugh, and he was a buyer for Gimbel's department store. He had made it, and I just thanked him heartily. Thank you, sir, for saving my life. I began a charity to raise money for survivors. I am a believer that it was wrong to force families to separate because women were not able to support themselves when they lose their husbands. Saving them from a watery grave to live a lifetime of poverty, in my opinion, was a very terrible thing to do. So I have used my reputation as a hero of the Titanic to talk about women's rights and that women should have the right to vote, the same as men. And I will continue to do that work the rest of my life, and I fight for the working man. Please do not call me the hero of the Titanic because I was not. The heroes of the Titanic stayed in the engine room, and they kept the lights on, and they knew that they were not going to survive. So think of them when you think of the Titanic. Don't think of me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Now we're going to get, I'll call off, well, first of all, if you came with friends, make sure you're sitting beside your friends